Much has been said about Africa's infrastructure potential. The question is there a model worth replicating? Perhaps Brazil. For more, we are joined by Darias. Darias, thank you so much for your time. So let's talk about Brazil's model. What makes it work, and can it be replicated?
If you look over the last 60 years or so, Brazil learned some hard lessons, but they bit the bullet and made some hard decisions when the time was right. They privatized, they developed models to work on a concessionary basis, and that really supported the mining industry, pushed up volumes, and is good enough for Africa to consider. I don't think we're in the era of prescribing, and that's certainly what we want to avoid. But my role covers the Western Hemisphere. So I look at the mining sector in North America, South America, Greenland. And I think this is the right conversation to be having, given the focus of this year's Indaba.
What prompted this conversation right now? Is it something that we've seen the whispers in the background, it's been lingering, and now finally the voices are getting a little bit louder? Talk to me about how we got here.
Well, look, there's some political alignment in Brazil at the moment with the African political leadership class, particularly in Southern Africa. Also, to be honest, there's a new direct flight between Cape Town and Sao Paulo, and Joburg and Sao Paulo. So, there's a flow of people now, easier than there was in the past. And then, of course, the focus on critical minerals that everybody's talking about, and the geopolitical dynamic and South-South cooperation. So it's ticking a lot of boxes, and it's now time to take a closer look.
We'll talk about the geopolitics in a bit, but if we're to consider a starting point, because we often say that Africa isn't a country, there's so many different countries with different elements underneath. Is there a starting point, at least, for an African country that would be willing to look at the Brazilian model, or that sees it and says, well, this is quite interesting?
Definitely. I mean, you look at the direction of travel for reform in South Africa. We'll be having a panelist from the presidency, and he'll certainly be talking to those experiences of how they've dealt with logistics as part of this overall reform initiative. So we all know the challenges being faced by Transnet. Transnet is on a good trajectory to address that, but partnership should be considered. Likewise, you look at what Guinea has done. With a variety of big infrastructure projects there, but the biggest one, of course, being the railway line from Simandou. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity. And what you must also remember is that the links are geological, essentially. It's the same iron ore deposits on the west coast of Central Africa that you have on the east coast of Brazil.
The one thing that we also bring up, especially when we talk about our own reform in South Africa, is that much of it can be controlled, I suppose, call it internally, but there are also aspects like geopolitics, which you can't control. There are these uncertain elements that can play out in any particular way for the remainder of the year. The role that geopolitics plays in the mining industry, what role is that? And what are some of the things you're paying attention to as these things start to evolve?
The geopolitical dynamic at play at the moment is one of a dominant power and a rising power, essentially, and a few other challenges here and there. And as a country with not as much power as the superpowers have, or a region with not as much power, you could see yourself as powerless, or you could see yourself as being in demand, and you can play both sides. And that's the pragmatic approach. And many countries in the global south do this. They manage to, butter their bread on both sides, as it were. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's looking after your own interests, primarily. So that's a dynamic. That's an opportunity. And on the specifics, it's about supply chains. The global north, the west, wants supply chains for a variety of reasons. Some more pragmatic, others more ideological. But again, use that as an opportunity and see how you can co-create.
With a lot of countries probably looking more inward as these geopolitics start to evolve, is there a concern for you about the risk of fragmentation?
Absolutely. And picking sides. And again, to my previous point, you don't have to pick a side. You can play both sides.
Let's talk the future. When you think about future-proofing the mining industry, what does that look like?
I think it's where leaders seize these opportunities. there have been enough lessons learned of fiscal irresponsibility, not always the fault exclusively of the host government. Often lenders advise and make certain suggestions that perhaps weren't the best. Let's learn from that. So fiscal prudence, maximizing revenue, and of course, all of this is built on responsible mining. I don't talk about it that often because it's assumed that that's everybody's baseline. So that's the bare minimum of meeting the highest standards of ESG. Even if some are concerned about that word, essentially it means playing your part, being a responsible player. So with that being said, we need to make exploration more effective. More money needs to go into exploration. The market countries need to put money into that. Permitting needs to be as effective and efficient as it can be. It needs to be transparent. You don't want to exclude anyone, but it has to operate fast. And you look at big copper projects in the DRC being permitted much faster than big copper projects in the US. So perhaps they can learn a bit from how things are done in the DRC. Infrastructure, of course, that's why we're talking about this, because infrastructure is a key enabler. And we were talking mainly about rail and the Brazilian model for that, but water infrastructure, power infrastructure, and then, of course, social infrastructure. Again, making sure the communities get those benefits. And just financing overall. Business as usual won't suffice. The market mechanism or the market clearance mechanism just will not be enough, particularly when you look at copper, which is of a much higher quantum to produce at than a battery metal or a rare earth, for example. So we need to get hundreds of billions of dollars of new investment into African copper mining to help meet the world's demand for copper that will be driven by overall economic development, rising living standards, climate action, and artificial intelligence. 1 gigawatt of data center for a artificial intelligence infrastructure requires somewhere between 45 to 70,000 tons of copper, even more. So to roll that out requires significant investment in copper. And so we need to look at sovereign wealth funds. We need to look at private equity funds. We need to look at development finance institutions. And so that's why it's so important to have events like this that bring together all those stakeholders, to have pragmatic, realistic, and specific conversations. We're at the beginning of the year and you're always having your performance reviews around this time or just at the end of last year. And you always say, make them smart, specific, measurable, accurate, reliable, time-bound, etc. Those are the conversations we must be having, not these broad conversations. That's just over-diagnosing the problem. Let's come up with real solutions.
As we wrap up the conversation, you were talking about the amount of money that's needed for infrastructure. Is the money there? Are the sovereign wealth funds, etc., and all the players that could plug in that money willing to do it, or is it still a risk aspect that sort of clouds that perspective?
A bit of both. There's interest. There's some willingness. You mentioned risk, and that's one of the mechanisms, risk mitigation, risk guarantees that can be given by development finance institutions. So yeah, it's an evolving process.
Darias, thank you.
Thank you so much.
For more insights, you can go to miningindaba.com.